Hello. Hi, Darryl.
Good morning, Laura.
Hello. So it is the 3rd of July, and it is actually almost 5:20 in the afternoon here in Germany, where I am at. And I am Laura Maria Caldarone, and this is 14 Days to Change. And with us, we have Darryl Ricker. Darryl runs the Canadian office of an American software company. Hi, Darryl.
Hi,
I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing great, thank you. And yourself?
Good, good. Sun is shining, so at least there's that on this side of the world. So Darryl is actually our sixth story in this series, but it is the second interview we have because the first one was on the 19th of June, so exactly 14 days ago. And Darryl, I'd like to show you bits and pieces of what we spoke about 2 weeks ago.
Sure.
So everybody can get to know you a little bit and we see what the situation was in Canada 2 weeks ago. But before we do that, I'm going to just tell you the current numbers in Canada and what the numbers were on the 19th of June, just so we have that in our mind. So as of today, July 3rd, Canada has 104,758 total cases, and it has 6,642 deaths. 2 weeks ago, on the 19th of June, Canada had 100,207 total cases, and it had 8,300 deaths. So that's how the situation has changed number-wise, reported number-wise, right? And let's have a look of what we spoke about 2 weeks ago. I'll ask you to go on mute. Perfect. I am gonna share my screen, and please let me know that you see everything and hear everything. And then we can start. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? So who you are, where you come from, and yeah, just give us something.
Sure, great. Yeah. So my name's Darryl Ricker. I live in Canada, near Toronto, which is our biggest city. I work in the city, but I actually live in a small town outside of the city. I work in the software industry, and I've lived in Canada my entire life. I grew up in the western part of Canada. Now I live in the eastern part of Canada. So, but I have traveled kind of all over the world as well. So right now there's 8 people in my house, which is kind of crazy, plus a dog and 3 cats. So you can imagine in the lockdown time, with most of us 24/7 inside here, been kind of nuts. And in fact, even in the quarantine time, we started to have wild animals because I live at the edge of town, show up like foxes and coyotes and skunks and things like that.
It's a little bit of entertainment.
Yeah, so that's probably enough about me for now. Anyway.
Just for a little bit away from you, tell me right now, what is it that is happening in Canada? What is the main topic that everybody's talking about, that the news are talking about? Maybe it's a concern, or just tell me a little bit, what is the situation in Canada right now?
Sure. I mean, I would say that COVID really is the thing that's kind of still the biggest news story, I guess worldwide, but certainly in Canada. A lot of us are still pretty much locked in our homes, and so that becomes a pretty good topic of conversation. We're starting to, by our provincial guidelines, we're allowed to go, sort of social distance from people. So starting to hang out a little bit on my deck at my front porch and stuff, but it's a weird kind of situation. So that's the most focusing thing. I think that having said that, a lot of Canadians are also paying close attention to what's going on in the U.S. Not just their COVID situation, but the economy, and of course the protests. So they're our closest neighbor. We watch that. We kind of, our hearts kind of break when we see some of the stuff going on. And it's very different than Canada, or very, very different. Canada and U.S. are very different. There's, we don't have a lot of gun culture here. We don't have, I would say, that as much of the racism as there is in the States. It's kind of hard to watch. So I would say,
system. Sorry to interrupt. Your healthcare system is completely different, right?
For sure. So a couple things have helped COVID here. One is we have free healthcare like a lot of countries do. So you can get in, and even though early on it was hard to get tests, at least you didn't have to go pay for it or worry about $100,000 bill at the end of it. If you got positive, like in the States, some people are getting multi-$100,000 bills when they're in there for 2 weeks and they're on a ventilator and things like that. So we don't have that concern. The other thing that our government, I'll credit them for this, that they did was they gave people $2,000 a month, not one time, but $2,000 a month every month that they're in they're unable to work. So anyone who wasn't able to work gets $2,000. Students get, I think, it's $1,200 for students if they're not able to work for the summer. And that changed a lot about people's feeling pressure to go back to work. Whereas in the States, they got the $1,200 one time. Half of them, I think, or some portion haven't even got it. Yeah, it took a long time to get it. And it's been months now, and those people feel pressure to go back to work. So they go back to work, they're spreaders, they're afraid to go to get a test because it's going to cost them money. It's kind of a perfect storm for disaster, right? And you see the numbers, the results.
Yeah, this morning it was over 120,000 deaths, and it was almost 2.3 million cases that I saw.
Yes.
And
yeah, no, it's crazy.
It's crazy. And you are a big neighbor. You're not a small neighbor of the United States. And
Correct.
yeah, it's very different, but even looking at your numbers, you can't compare. What were the cases? I think.
Yeah, we have about 100,000 countrywide. About a third of those are in my province, which actually is the biggest province. Had just over 8,000 deaths, 8,300 deaths as of yesterday. So per capita, we're roughly about half on most fronts with the U.S. Not that the U.S. is a great country to calibrate yourself against right now. So there's things we could have done, and we'll talk about that we could have done better. But certainly compared to the U.S., and the numbers are going down. Interestingly, you said about news. I mean, in my province specifically today, we're opening up a whole bunch of what we call phase 2 businesses. So hairdressers and so on. You probably tell my hair hasn't been cut for a while. So, that stuff's happening literally today, starting in the province I live, which is called Ontario. So I'm a little on edge, and I think other people are to see what happens out of that, because it could happen like in the States where it sparks another kind of outbreak and things like that. So, but yeah, our numbers have been much better than the U.S., but still maybe not as good as we'd love them to be.
Could have been. And just staying a little bit longer on this topic, 2 questions. The first one is, you said hairdressers are gonna open today. Will you or a member of your family already go, or you are going to wait a little bit longer?
I know I have a nephew that lives with us, but one of the 8 people in our house is my nephew who lives with us. And he has this crazy curly hair, and so he's going, I think, next week as soon as he can. I'm going to go a little later. We've been very careful. In fact, my family doesn't let me out generally because I'm right now the sole incomer. So we go out once a week kind of thing for groceries and stuff like that. So we've been very careful. So we'll probably continue to be cautious about that type of thing. But I will at some point probably get my haircut. But I'll see how the early days go.
Okay, so still cautious even if everything. Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
And the second question, staying with Canada and the US, could you just tell me the latest on the border? What is happening with the deal between Canada and the US border?
Sure, yeah. So we closed the border kind of mid to late March. I think it was the 22nd, I think, of March or something like that, where we closed the border to the US, unless you were a Canadian citizen, even kind of encourage Canadian citizens to come back. A lot of healthcare providers, we have a lot of what they call snowbirds, people that go from Canada in the winter to Florida and Arizona. They were told by their healthcare insurers to get the heck out of the US because they wouldn't cover them if they got sick. So we had a huge influx back, but it was around, again, late kind of March. And then that's been locked down really all the way through. And it's opening up at the end of June. They're allowing, I'm not sure how much influx of people, but the current date is June 30th, and they'll allow you to come in if you've got, I think, an immediate family, so it would have to be a child or a parent in Canada. And I'm not even sure if you may have to provide some actual reason as well. Maybe you've got a sick parent or something, but I think at the minimum you have to at least be direct relation. So if I've got an aunt or uncle or cousin, that doesn't cut it. And they'll still kind of, I think, still be pretty tightly restricted because obviously the situation is not under control down there. We don't want to import that here. So.
Of course not. I mean, look at what happened with New Zealand. New Zealand is still inspiration and a story of hope.
That's great. It's awesome.
But they, after I think 25, 26 days of 0 new cases, they suddenly had 2 cases in one day, and they were imported cases. There were people, residents of New Zealand that came from Europe. And unfortunately, they were supposed to stay in quarantine, but they got permission to just go out of the premises, and it turns out they were positive. So it really only takes one exception, right?
Literally one person, yeah.
One person. So I hope the border holds like what it needs to be.
I do too, and I have lots of American friends and family and coworkers. I would love them to come up here, and then people online are always asking me on, can we come up to Canada? Like, people don't know me, but yeah, as much as I like many Americans, I don't really want to bring a pandemic up here. So,
yeah,
or more of a pandemic.
More of a pandemic. No thanks. And what are your hopes? So, what are your hopes, your concerns with Canada? What do you think, based on what has been happening lately, on the fact that today so many you're moving faces and so many things are opening up? What do you think is going to happen in the next few days, in the next weeks? What is it that you don't want to just tell me your predictions, let's say.
Sure. I mean, my hope, I think, like everyone, is that we find a vaccine as quickly as possible, before we have to get herd immunity kind of the bad way, right? But my concern is, and I see it, here in Canada, people are getting restless. I see it more so in the States. People are tired of being locked up and restricted. They want to go back to normal. And I've got kids, and they want to go back to normal. And they're eager to go hang out with their friends, and then we have to kind of hold them back a little bit. It's tough, right? And as I mentioned, today, is a day a bunch of things are opening here in my province. So we'll see what happens. It does worry me that we're going to have another spike. And if we have another spike, we're kind of back to square one a lot of ways, right? Which I think is what some of these, rogue states in the U.S. are going to see as well. So I don't want to have the entire province to go back into shutdown mode. So I want people to be, my dream or wish is I want people to be kind of smart, realize this is a once in a lifetime thing. It's hard to convince, especially kids who are 12 and 15 and 20 or whatever, that this is a once in a lifetime thing, because their lifetime is short, and they're part of this kind of more adultish kind of lifetime is almost minimal. So, but even for people who've been around 100 years, they haven't seen this. Right? You have to be around 102 years to see the Spanish flu, right? So, it's we have to conduct ourselves differently because it's that kind of once in a century or more thing. We have to accept that we have to do things differently than we do for anything else, and it is different, but it's okay to be different. So I hope people can kind of get that. But I have a bad feeling in a lot of places it's going to take a downturn to trigger that in people to go, oh yeah, this is really bad. So
are you talking about Canada or in general?
I think in both. Like even though I'm saying people in Canada are acting more intelligently and more kind of cautious, and they are, but if today, everyone goes and just says, hey, like I can go to restaurants, I can go get my hair done, and and they just go back to normal, and they start hanging out in their patio, and they start inviting people into their houses and having parties, and all of a sudden we're back to square one. So, but yeah, in the States it's obvious because you see the videos of it, but I think here there's a risk here too, right? People were tired of as much as previous generations did crazy sacrifices, for World War I and World War II, and like our sacrifice has been having to sit home and watch Netflix, but people are tired of that, right? So
especially in the end, of course, there is a difference, and when we speak about staying at home, we speak about the privilege, right? The ones that can afford to stay at home, can work.
It is a privilege.
And in the end, it is those people, so it is us that should do it even more in order to help the ones that can't, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And yeah, I'm with you. I see it also everywhere. So hopefully it's your hopes that come true and not your concerns.
Yeah, exactly.
And to finish off our conversation, I have one last philosophical question, let's say.
Sure.
And that would be, if you could give a message to yourself. So if you could give a message to the Darryl in 14 days, what is it that you would tell him?
Okay. I think I would tell him, and I probably would go back in time even further, but to enjoy the break from the commuting and the crazy random shopping trips, 3 times in a weekend, and just enjoy the time with the family and get outside more, spend less time on Twitter probably. Remind myself how fortunate, I am to be able to work and provide for the family. I really, several months in, I still haven't really adjusted as well as I should have. I work too much. I'm stressed out about work. I'm stressed out about COVID. I'm stressed about the protests. So I haven't really kind of just taken a breath and gone out and enjoyed, everything. And so maybe 14 days from now, I'll be able to have a different take on that. But that would be kind of my hope. And I should have done that 3 months ago, but I'll tell my future self to enjoy this situation more.
To enjoy it. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Darryl, for
very welcome.
Wonderful conversation. It was the topic very interesting and heartbreaking, but it was really a pleasure to be able to understand more what has happened, what is happening with Canada. And on that note, we will see each other in 14 days.
Fantastic.
So we see what has happened in between. So
thank you. That was a lot of fun. So thank you very, very much for inviting me, and I really enjoyed it. And we will talk again in 14 days.
Yes. See you. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.
So that is it. So Darryl, first things first, how do you feel? Because this is the first time you see the interview we had 2 weeks ago. Tell me.
Sure. I mean, beyond the normal terror of having to watch and hear yourself on video and audio, which is always bad. Yeah, no, it was neat. I remember mostly saying most of those things, but it's kind of neat to hear it played back 14 days later. Yeah, it's good, and it's interesting because maybe it's one of your questions, but I'll answer it maybe ahead of your question. But the advice to my future self, I did take. I've been trying to get outside. Like in the morning, I wake up usually earlier than everyone else because I have to work, so I've been going outside to my back deck and sitting in the sun and having my coffee and kind of usually reading Twitter, sometimes looking at email and stuff, but usually just relaxing and getting some sun so I've been, and I'm trying to spend more time with the kids and stuff, with them in lockdown and dig them out of their rooms and they're playing video games. So I did try to immediately, right after we talked, try to put that in action. I think I've done okay with that, so I'm kind of happy about that part.
So you listened to your past self.
I did, yeah.
And see, it's a small thing, but
it's a huge thing.
It's a small thing in the sense that you can do it, right? It's you that just takes a step.
Right.
And
correct.
You did it, and you.
Yeah. So thank you for that.
To remind you of what you yourself told you. What about your concerns and your hopes? So we already spoke about the numbers, and in the grand scheme of things, the numbers in Canada, yes, they have gotten a little bit worse, but not as much as we have unfortunately seen with your neighbor, the United States.
Right.
And with other countries, of course, Brazil, India, and so on. So tell me, Canada.
Sure. The numbers haven't been that bad, certainly the last couple of weeks, which is great. Certainly, I mentioned in that first conversation, my province opened up 2 weeks ago. I did get a haircut yesterday, so I did take advantage of that. And it was interesting because my barber, I go to like an old school barber, right? So, but he had like plastic, barriers set up. He had to rearrange his whole shop. It's, you can only have every second chair taken up, and it's really impacting his business. But I had to put in hand sanitizer. I had to wear a mask. He had a mask and a face shield. Like, it's a very different kind of experience. But at least I got a haircut, and but it sort of was a stark reminder of the world that has changed, at least temporarily,
at least
and maybe
temporarily,
longer.
and we need to take it seriously. But just before you continue and tell
Sure.
me about the other things, out of curiosity, taking, maybe it helps or doesn't help the fact that it's your barber that and you've been to several times throughout the years, but how did it feel? Did you feel safe, or was it uncomfortable, or was it weird, or how did you feel? I mean, you just described it, but what were you feeling?
Yeah, I think I felt fairly safe. I mean, he had sent a reminder out ahead of time of all the safety protocols, and when I got there, I was made to use hand sanitizer. Everything was kind of isolated. He had taken all the kind of shelves away and things like that. It was kind of, I had a very specific spot to put my glasses down, and he was going to assume he was going to, sanitize after. He even talked about the fact he was taking even less appointments because he had to spend 20 minutes in between each appointment, cleaning it up and stuff. And then on the way out, I, used the hand sanitizer, and I got home and washed my hands and hands. I mean, it was just like, so I didn't feel unsafe there. To be honest, if it was anything other than probably a haircut, like if I was a female and I needed my nails painted or, anything like that, I don't think I would have done that. But again, that's, maybe a haircut is the same for a man. I don't know, but that to me was not necessary, but kind of borderline necessary kind of thing. So I had a couple amateur haircuts during the quarantine, and I needed a kind of professional one. So, but one thing I have noticed here, is that since the opening up, that people I've noticed in the grocery store, and I don't go very often because my family generally doesn't want me to go out, but when I do go out, I've noticed every time I go out, there's less and less people wearing masks. And that kind of concerns me less. Yeah. Whereas I would say with the very start of it, a lot of people in my little town here were wearing masks. And then, later on it was less people, but still the majority. And now I think it like a couple times it was like, I felt like I was maybe one of 10% or 15% of people in the store wearing a mask. And so I don't know how much that is around the opening up in the province and the country. How much of it is, and I hate to blame the U.S., but how much is that U.S. influence of that mask being politicized and kind of mask shaming and things like that? But the data could lag, obviously, as it's 2 weeks since we opened up. Maybe the cases are going to only start spiking now. I think we're okay. The numbers are down low enough that, again, the risk, especially in my little area here, of getting COVID is quite low. But of course, it just takes one person to transmit it. But the concern, obviously, and I mentioned the states when we talked 2 weeks ago, and I didn't hope for this, obviously, but I expected that Texas, Georgia, Arizona, Florida were going to spike, and they are. And I think it's some crazy number, like 70% of the U.S. states are on the upswing, and like in a bad way. And those charts you see where all the other countries are going down, and the U.S. is just going boom, right? And it's terrifying because it's not just a graph you and I are looking at. It's people getting this, and there's a death rate to it. So that means if the case rate goes up, the death rate goes up. It's elderly people, now it's some young people, it's people who are grandparents and parents and brothers and sisters and uncles, and like it's real people. That's what I always try to remember myself when I'm looking at the data. And it's hard because it just looks like a chart, but like that's somebody's grandparent or parent or sibling or whatever that died, and
Somebody, right?
their life is impacted in a way that is not fixable, right? So
and also there's the fact that in my opinion, it's not spoken enough, because here it's like you die or you don't die. And that's basically how a lot of people see it. That's the narrative of the conversation, right? Oh, like if you get it, most people will be fine, some will die. So it's either you are okay or you die. You get it, you okay and die. But no, because first of all, it's so new, the virus still, even though we're 7 months in, and we are still discovering things. First of all, you have people that had mild symptoms, so they were infected, they had the disease, but it was mild, and the only thing they lost was their sense of smell and taste, and they recovered. And it's like 2 months, 3 months later, and they still cannot smell and cannot taste. And some people might say, okay, it's not that bad. I think it's pretty bad. But aside from that, if you lose that, it means the disease touched your brain, basically.
Right.
And there's so many other things, so many other side effects that we don't know, and also future side effects, right? Not only what's going to happen in the next weeks or months, but in the next years.
Right. Yeah, I'm hearing things like lung function impacts, even people who are asymptomatic, something around blood, like some change in their blood composition, and there's weird things that we won't know about. It's kind of like the old days of smoking. Like people eventually found out what smoking did to people, but not for a long time. And so yeah, we don't know what's going to happen. And one of the things that that happened, it was a controversial thing this week in my province. The chief health officer in the province of Ontario said that people could go back to work if they were asymptomatic but had tested positive, as long as they followed all the health protocols. And that was very controversial because it's really countered all the advice worldwide, including obviously WHO and stuff. So
what's the logic?
Apparently a lot of it was around, we have a large kind of migrant farm worker population in our province, and apparently it was a lot around of that was those people weren't getting tested because the farmers didn't want to have the people stop working. So the health officer thought, it's convoluted, but somehow thought that if they let them get tested and didn't stop them from working, like that it would be, they'd be more likely to get tested. It was very bizarre, but we talked earlier, before the recording, and there's 3 migrant farm workers that came from Mexico into, the southern part of my province.
Okay, so we're back. You froze for a little bit, so we had to cut. And nothing. Let's continue with the conversation, and afterwards I will just connect both videos. So the last thing you were telling us before we froze, was about these 3 migrant workers that came to your province. So please.
Sure. Yeah. There was, I mean, it's a whole bunch of migrant workers, some from Mexico, some from Jamaica, other places, but 3 particular ones from Mexico actually died of COVID-19. So, I read that this morning, and I was like just sort of heartbroken, because these people come to Canada to earn a bunch of money during our growing season to feed their families going back. So, one thing I'm going to check into is to see if there's some kind of GoFundMe's, set up for these folks, and at the very minimum, donate. If there's not something, I'll try to see if I can orchestrate the right people to get it set up. Because I just feel sick that someone would send their loved one, their dad, their husband, whatever, to Canada for the season to make money, and then they don't come back. It's kind of very heartbreaking, and that's 3 out of many people have died in Canada, but those 3 I feel actually even more particularly sad about.
Because like you said, they go to a different country to earn for a certain amount of time to send it back home, because obviously things back home are not great, and this happens. So just the thought of your health official, I don't know, I really found it a bit weird, this thing that you just told me, especially because recently we've spoken about it and there's been studies, but there's just the newest study now that came out from Nature Research that speaks about, the epicenter of Italy back in February. They've been studying it, and it shows that over 40% of the people were asymptomatic. And we already know that, you can be infecting, you can be sick without having symptoms. And you shouldn't be working if you have symptoms, because you'll be infecting other people, and who knows who you're infecting. And
correct.
I don't see the logic.
Yeah, I don't understand it either, and I'll dig in more into it. But it was just this past week that it came out, and it was certainly controversial here. So
I can imagine. And just this also reminded me what you were saying earlier about the fact that recently your family has told you, and you've seen like less people wearing masks, right? And I see the same here. In Germany, it is true that masks were never compulsory. You had to wear them if you went into a supermarket or the bank or any place that was indoors. But outside, no, it really depended on you. But you did see people before. Now you don't. And as I look throughout the different countries, like the situation, there's this false sense of security.
Right, that it's over.
And it's so scary because as we know, you especially, that you like to play, and last time you told us you like to play with data, and you're a math person, you're a number person, so you're really looking into that, just like experts and epidemiologists, etc. do. And even the World Health Organization just said something that we knew, but obviously we needed to hear, which is, yes, although most countries are doing well, relatively well, handling the pandemic in general from a global perspective, because that's what the pandemic is, right? From a global perspective, it's actually accelerating. So every week there's more and more cases, and you just need to look at your neighbor, right?
Yeah, 55,000 cases, I think, yesterday.
And every day they have a new record. It's like the record, it's the new record. And
yeah, it's not good. Yeah, it's not good. So hopefully we'll see people here being smart. I mean, Canadians are generally kind of compliant and obedient. But again, I'm not trying to blame the States, but I mean, there's so much misinformation coming out of the States. And so many people seeing, Florida and Arizona and so on. I mean, before this last couple of weeks, back to normal, beaches and restaurants and bars, and they're like, why can't I do that? And I see it in my kids, because they're, they don't understand some of the long-term risks and implications of this. So they're like, hey, let's get back to normal, right? So it's a dangerous trend if it continues. So, but hopefully, at least here between the generally hopefully compliant people, but also just the cases are going down. If there's no cases to spread, then you can be a little more free. But it frightens me. to be honest.
I mean, just what you said right now, that it, it it really depends on where you are, what your reality is. So not only in your country, in your continent, but really in the city that you live in, the region. So if the transmission rate is low, then you have less of a risk. So you can do that outing. There's less of a risk, but that's why we should be aware about, you know, where we live, obviously, but also our area, because every area is different.
Correct.
And but it doesn't just stop, right? This false sense of security. I mean, all these things, for instance, going back to your neighbor, because fortunately, unfortunately, it has been headlines over and over again internationally, because we outside watch and we can't believe, because there are examples, there is information, there is knowledge of what to do and what not to do. So why would you be, you know, going blind, like driving around blindly?
Exactly.
And I don't know, masks is one of the things, but obviously it's not the only thing. It's part of the solution, as we've said. I don't know. It's a difficult topic, but indeed, the fact that Canada is doing better doesn't mean that that everything is fine and you should forget about it.
Exactly.
Talking about everything is fine and forgetting about it, and just Canada and the States. Last time we spoke a little bit about borders. I'd
Yes.
like you to tell me if there's been any changes between Canada and the States, especially because, as you surely seen, you are one of the very few countries in the world that is welcomed in the European Union. From the
Right.
Americas, it's just you and Uruguay. The United
Right.
States
Right.
completely banned. Latin America, of course, banned, but not you.
Yes. Yeah. So I didn't check. I know the date, the proposed date was June 30th. I haven't checked since then whether they changed that. I think it's still valid of letting people with immediate relatives come up here. I know one of the things they're talking about, particularly, I don't know why it's only in the West Coast, but in theory, anyone can go into Canada right now, apparently, and say they are going en route to Alaska.
Oh.
And they were apparently not doing a very good job of sort of, well, they can't really police that. They can't follow that person around. So apparently, especially on the West Coast, where in theory you could be going from Seattle to Alaska, and it kind of was like more plausible. They were concerned about that happening. So I was just reading, kind of scanning an article about that today. But I haven't heard anything. The fact that they changed the date for the border to be open. But again, it's very restrictive. You have to have, I think, a child or a parent in Canada. And again, I'm not even sure. I haven't looked into the fine print, but you may have to have a reason still to do that. Like my dad is sick, I have to get across the border. So but it's definitely not a free for all. So
No, and
it can't be.
and it cannot be, exactly. I mean, here in Europe, we're actually there's a good amount of people that are afraid, that are concerned. I am obviously one of them, because this back and forth in countries, especially if I'm not mistaken, you, Canada, are requiring quarantine. So you are making sure that people quarantine. In Europe, no. You, for instance, the UK, not to target the UK, but a little bit to target them, because they're not doing very well. And they continue to not do very well. They can go to other countries in Europe without quarantine, because, for instance, Spain does not require it because their economy is not doing well. So obviously they want people to come. And who's going to
Right.
travel if you have to stay 14 days stuck in a room somewhere, right?
Exactly.
It's but then when they go back home, supposedly they have to stay 14 days somewhere. Is that going to be the case? I don't know. Greece has, for instance, said no to the UK and to Sweden, at least until the mid-month, so half of around the 15th of July. And there's this economy and health thing, that narrative that has been erroneously spoken about from the beginning, that you need one or the other. But you that like numbers, you know, you see that that's not the case, because who's going to want to go shopping if they don't feel safe, if things are not good?
Exactly. Yeah, you can't reopen the open economy without solving the health crisis, right?
Exactly. I don't know. So
Yeah,
keep your borders. Just like,
we will. I hope. I don't have personal control over it, but
keep your borders.
I'm not that influential.
The United States and Canada, how is this affecting you as a country, the situation in the US? Because I was like skimming a little bit here and there before our conversation, and one of the things that I saw from a Canadian perspective was saying, you know, there's a lot of talk about the United States, how it's declining, especially because of their response to the pandemic. And it's looked at from an international perspective and obviously national, but it actually does affect Canada. And I didn't have time to deep dive in anything. And I just wanted to hear from you as a Canadian that works for an American company. How so?
Sure. I mean, the reality of Canada, it's very similar to kind of New Zealand and Australia, or anytime there's a small country right beside a big country. So, you know, we are about at 1/10 of the size of the U.S. A lot of our, I mean, majority of our exports go to the U.S. So, you know, in Canada, we have a market of 40 million people. Down there, all of a sudden, we turn into, like, adding Canada and U.S. together, 370 million people. So tons of Canadian companies export their goods down there. And so if the economy is failing down there, that means our goods aren't being purchased potentially down there to the degree that they are. Also, to even things like the exchange rate. So exchange rate, historically, our dollar has been quite a bit lower than the U.S. Sometimes, you know, 60 cents to a dollar, sometimes 70 cents to a dollar. Very rarely has it been at par. You know, it's been years since it was at par, and that actually is to our advantage because, you know, the American purchasing power is better in, you know, buying Canadian stuff. You know, if their economy falters, generally our dollar strengthens compared to theirs. And so on top of their economy faltering and having less purchasing power, now there's a less of a discrepancy in the interest rate to our disadvantage. So, you know, just speaking economically and not health-wise, you know, those two things can really impact a lot of Canadian companies who are relying on a huge US market compared to the Canadian market. Does that make sense?
You did explain it more for people that are not so into it. So I think if I understood it, I'm sure everybody else understood it.
Okay, perfect.
Especially because as you saw, I'm not very aware of the dynamics between Canada and the States.
Right. Yeah, it's a pretty free border in terms of goods going back and forth. So we're part of the free trade agreement with Mexico, Canada, and the US.
The US. And I think, I mean, you know, you and I could speak about many topics for a very, very long time. But I just have one more thing from my side to say, and then I like to see if maybe there's something specific that you want to say before our last question. And just my thing was, in the video that we saw from the 19th of June, I mentioned the numbers, the situation of the United States. And just to put it in context, the numbers that I had used came from Worldometer on the 19th. And that's why, because I'm sure people that watch are going to see and say, okay, but right now, those are the numbers. So different platforms, different databases have different numbers. And that's really, there's a lot of reasons. Some of them are because, you know, they don't have access to all of the data. Some of it is because it's, I don't know, recorded once a day or so on. And just so we see the difference from a Worldometer perspective. On the 19th of June, those were the numbers. And now, 3rd of July, it's 131,632 cases. So roughly 10,000 cases more. And I mean, deaths, sorry, that's even worse. 10,000 deaths more than on the 19th.
You're talking about, yeah, US data, yeah.
US. So that was two weeks, 10,000 deaths. And cases actually crazy. Well, you even spoke about how the latest number was 50,000, 55,000 in one day, right? And right now they have a little bit over 2.85 million cases. And yeah, I just want to put it here in this video so people don't get too confused with numbers, because
sure
it's confusing. And yeah, that's your neighbor.
Yeah, it's scary for us, but it's also I feel bad for them because it's kind of they're hostage to decisions from their government, right? Their governors, the federal government, obviously the administration, and the president's administration. They're kind of hostage to that, and it's I feel sad for them.
Definitely, because as we've seen and spoken about, the pandemic will not end until it ends everywhere. So you cannot think only about, you know, your little bubble, your country, your city, even your continent. And
Correct.
especially with now all these borders opening, right? It's difficult. So Darryl, before I ask you my last question, is there anything else you want to share with us from your experience or Canada's situation or anything else?
I don't think so. Between this discussion and our last one, I think we covered a whole lot of ground. So I think I've probably said everything I
So you're
can
happy.
say. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Then my last question. Last time that we spoke, I asked you to give your future self a message, which you did. And then you told us that you actually did do those things that you had wanted to do. My question now is, based on this storytelling experience that you've had with me and 14 Days to Change, the current situation now in Canada, and just how you have lived this pandemic and your knowledge now, what is the message that you right now, 3rd of July, give to your fellow Canadians, your fellow North Americans, and anybody else that you want to speak? And doesn't really matter if the country that hears you is worse off than Canada or doing better off, right? Because we just need to keep on doing it. We can't just forget about it, right? So
Right.
what's your message?
Yeah, I think my message to everybody, you know, worldwide and you know, including Canada, obviously, is to stay smart, to stay safe, to recognize that this doesn't get fixed until there's, you know, a vaccine to solve it. You know, we still have a risk every time we interact with somebody who just happens to have that coronavirus. That we catch it, we give it to our loved ones and our friends and our family, and you know, nothing changes until that vaccine comes. So people need to really still be smart and wear masks and social distance, and you know, just be smart, because it's life or death for some people who end up getting it, and that's, I think it still hasn't really gotten to everyone's minds because not everyone knows someone who gets impacted. So that's all I can say is just be smart, be safe, trust scientists, trust the math. Yeah, stay safe. Stay safe.
Well, more straightforward answer there could be none, and it's realistic. It's the situation, right? Darryl, exactly. It has been really nice. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you for telling us about what has changed, how it has changed, not only in your life, because it's your story, but Canada, and also a little bit about your neighbor, because everybody's talking about that neighbor, right? And yes, I really hope things improve or stay in Canada and everywhere else. And that's it. 14 Days to Change. We heard your story, Darryl, and Canada's. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. Have a great day.
Bye.